could slowly start again. I hope everyone can hear me. So it is time for our 5th session of the conference with the title Gender Equality in Governing, and our first presenter should be Pantelis Chalkias, a PhD candidate at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki.
Dobre večer. Good evening from me.
Good evening.
I would like to thank the University of Belgrade, the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and especially Professor Kalliopi Papakonstantinou. Please allow me to share my screen, my presentation. What's going on? I'm sorry for this.
No problem. You should be able to. Yes, it's starting.
Okay. My topic is if women fit to govern in Aristophanes' Lysistrata. Why Lysistrata? Lysistrata is, first of all, it's a play which was taught during the year 411 BC, during the festival of Lina, a festival in favor of god Dionysos. It was held at late winter, early spring. The main plot is that the Athenian Lysistrata, along with other Athenian and Peloponnesian female citizens, and some from Boeotia, gather in Athens during the night and decide to act in order to stop the Peloponnesian War. The means to achieve that is by no longer having sexual contact with their husbands. What is the historical which was the history behind this play? Of course, Peloponnesian War had been through several phases. From the year 421 BC, there had been a treaty between Athens and Sparta that was breached by Athens during the years 415 to 413 BC, when the Athenians decided illegally to commence a naval expedition towards Sicily, telling that they were going to help their ally Egesta. But the real reason is exhibited by a later historian, Diodorus of Sicily, who tells us that the real reason behind this expedition was the Athenian imperialism. The Athenians, not the Athenians in general, but the generals and the Vouli, the 10 generals and the Vouli, secretly had assembled and decided to convince the assembly of the people, the Athenian citizens, to commence this expedition so that they could conquer Sicily and impose taxes on its city-states. So the first thing is that this act of war had no real justification. Now, as for the main question of our paper, were women in classical Athens fit to govern? At first thought, they were not allowed to govern. They were not allowed to have participation in the decisions of the state. But they were the housekeepers. And the house in the ancient Greek, was called Ikos. In a few words, they were managing the fortune of their husbands. They were responsible for managing the fortune of their husbands and giving birth to legitimate heirs to them. Lysistrata gathers the women all over Greece during the night. This probably caused the spectators to think negatively of such an action, but at the end of their meeting, they all go under oath. And this is the first deeply political action of women in Lysistrata, since going under oath was a prerequisite for taking every authority in ancient Athens. Why would the women want to stop war? Because there was no justification in that, and they knew, all the Athenians knew, that this war was only to the interests of some people, mainly the oligarchs and some people who wanted to make fortune out of this. And Thucydides writes in his histories that it was the leader of the oligarchs, the Pisander, that wanted that secretly worked for the destruction of the democracy. Another very important thing is that at the same time, Alcibiades, who had fled to Persia after he had been convicted of mocking the Eleusinian mysteries, had been also talking secretly with the Persian Tissaphernes, so he would help him go back to Athens, but after democracy had been eliminated, because it was democracy that had condemned him. The acts of Pisander are being directly expressed by Lysistrata in the play, in the verses 490 and 491, where she tells she tells Probulus that Pisander and the other Ophikia chasers are only to steal and have the others suffer. At this point, we should say that the Probulus, probuli, in ancient Athens, there were 10 elected probuli. There were officials that would think on every law and every suggestion that would be introduced in the assembly of the people. At this point, at this certain time, probably were causing negative thoughts to the people, because as it was proved later on, 4 months later, Pisander used them to establish oligarchy. The first main political action of the women in Lysistrata was the oath. The other important verses in Lysistrata are verses 650 and 651, where the leader of the women chorus were led to the treasury after the agreement of the women had been established. So they kept it closed, and men did not have the ability to have access to the money and continue the war. The leader of the women tells the leader of the men's chorus that she might not be an official, might not have any public. She might be this. She might not have any official authority, but she's the one who gives birth to the men who fight, and therefore she should be well respected. In verse 983, as the sex strike has been on for a long time, comes a man from Sparta, so he proposes peace to the Athenians, because women all over Greece are into it, and this cannot be handled by men. And this is where the chorus of the old men admits that women's will is very, very hard to fight. What can we exclude from all this? First of all, women in Lysistrata have acquired the virtues a leader must have. They have integrity. They serve the public good and justice. They have courage to fight for their purpose, and they have the bravery to stand still in a very hostile environment, where they have no means of when they have no other authority. In that way, women are get free from their passions, because they only serve public good. This is and therefore they are fit to govern. This play. Some people say that it's we can see some misogyny behind this, but in my opinion, from Aristophanes, Aristophanes could not literally express his opinion to his fellow citizens. He just wanted to say that they have gone very far away from the original principles of Athenian democracy, the original principle of Athenian democracy, which was the serving of the public good. And he wanted to tell them that dangers all around. There are many dangers around around the democracy. Something which was, in fact, for which he was in fact proven right 4 months later, when Pisander finally tried to destroy democracy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We're now continuing, and the discussion will be in the end as previously. We are about to share the presentation of our next speaker, who is Professor Igor Milinković from the University of Banja Luka Faculty of Law, an old friend of our faculty and head of the department of the State Law Department there. Go ahead, Professor.
No, it will be fine. Thank you. It is a real pleasure to attend this conference. Congratulations to the organizer. In my presentation, I will offer a review of contemporary provisions related to the issue of or subject of royal succession. I will try to keep it short, especially in this first introductory part, but just a few of general informations. In the theory of state, monarchy is considered a form of government. The other one is a republic. And according to Bogdanor, in the strict sense of the term, monarchy can be defined as a state ruled by a single absolute hereditary ruler. However, this is incomplete definition since it is related only to the absolute monarchy. So I quoted another one. According to this definition, monarchy can be defined as a rule by one man, where there is a hereditary element in the succession. Of course, there are exceptions of this definition. For example, elective monarchies, the existence of a collective head of state, but most authors agree that these are essential characteristics of a monarchy. However, in the theory of the state, many authors argue that essential characteristic of a monarchical form of government is a legal and political responsibility of a monarch. Indeed, this is one of key features of a monarchical form of government, as Dicey stated in his famous book. If the queen were herself to shoot the premier, no court in England could take cognizance of the act. Regarding the political responsibility of a monarch, it is also a feature of this form of government. But that political irresponsibility of a head of a state is moderated by the principle king cannot act alone. So there is a political responsibility of ministers in relation to the parliament. However, there are some examples in practice where some forms of or mechanisms of political responsibility of monarch has been introduced. For example, in Liechtenstein, one of the European monarchies, there is a possibility of a motion of no confidence against the prince via referendum. This mechanism is stipulated by the constitution of Liechtenstein. Obviously, there is a tension between a monarchical form of government and a democratic order. There is an issue of democratic legitimacy within regarding this issue. As Talok stated, the difference between a dictatorship and the kingdom is, as far as I can see, I quote, simply that the kingdom tend to be hereditary. However, some authors argue that monarchy is, and the institution of a monarch is very valuable for the functioning of democratic institutions. Some authors stated that a constitutional monarch as a neutral power is a source of stability in modern democracies. Some other authors argue that monarchy is perfectly compatible with democracy and can help strengthen citizens' loyalty to the system of government. So that different views exists related to the relation between monarchical form of government and a democratic order. Historically, monarchy is a dominant form of government. However, today there are only 44 monarchies in the world, and in Europe there are 12 monarchies. Monarchy demonstrated a sort of durability or resilience. And one can ask the question, what is the key of the sort of success of a monarchical form of government? One can argue that this is an ability to adapt to new political and social reality, but obviously there is a need for new basis of legitimacy of this form of government. As Professor Baines talked yesterday, in earlier historical periods, there was a divine authority beside or behind a monarch. Today, there is a need for another form of and another basis of political legitimacy. I will mention one of the influential legal theorists, Jeremy Waldron. According to Jeremy Waldron, modern concept of human dignity should be understood as equalization of ranks, so a sort of a leveling up the status of aristocrats and the status of common citizens. But this is a two-way process. It is not just about broadening the scope of the rights of the citizens, but it is also about democratizing aristocratic institutions, including the position of monarchs. So there is a tendency to organize and define status of a monarch based on the application of the principle of equality. And now I will make some observations related to the achievement of gender equality within provisions on royal succession. I will quote classification offered by Evgeny Spektorsky, a very influential author. He was teaching at the Faculty of Law here in Belgrade. Belgrade in some period between the First and the Second World War. According to Spektorsky, there are three main models of royal succession. First is the so-called Salic law, or agnatic primogeniture. According to Salic law, that arrangement entirely excludes females from the succession. And I mentioned some examples of the application of the Salic law. For example, Albertine Constitution, and also Belgium's Constitution of 1831. According to the Constitution of Belgium, I quote original text, the constitutional powers of the king shall be the king hereditary, indirect, natural, and legitimate descent from His Royal Highness Leopold of Saxe-Coburg from male to male by rule of primogeniture and to perpetual exclusion of women and their descendants. The other model would be Spektorski used the term Dutch-Austrian model. According to this model, daughters are only permitted to inherit the title if there are no male members of the ruling dynasty. You can also see relevant provisions of some constitutions. And third model would be a so-called Castilian model. According to this model, if there are no sons, daughters can inherit a throne. Now I will briefly explore this trend of introducing gender equality in royal succession rules. First European monarchy that introduced this model was Sweden in 1980. And after Sweden, Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, Luxembourg, and finally in 2013, United Kingdom. I'm talking about European monarchies right now. In 2013, the UK Succession to the Crown Act was adopted. And according to this act, the gender of a person born after October 2011 does not give that person or that person's descendants precedence over any other person whenever born. Some other restrictions were also removed. For example, a person is not disqualified from succeeding to the crown or from possessing it as a result of marrying a person of the Roman Catholic faith. However, there is exception of this rule. For example, Spain, where male preference primogeniture system was or has been retained because there are initiatives to change this constitutional provision. Also, Monaco, one of European microstates or micromonarchies, the male preference primogeniture system has also been retained, and Liechtenstein, where Salic law is still adopted, although Liechtenstein was criticized by the UN committee for eliminating the forms of discrimination of women because of this solution. What about other parts of the world? In other parts of the world, mainly this traditional model of male preference was kept. For example, you can see the relevant provisions of the Constitution of Jordan or of the Constitution of Morocco. Also in Asia, in Japan, for example, although this issue is not regulated by the Constitution of Japan, but by imperial household law, there is also a rule that imperial throne shall be succeeded by a male offspring in the male line belonging to the imperial lineage. And this is a controversial subject in Japan because there are no female descendants of imperial lineage, but most probably, according to the commentators, this rule won't be changed, but next successor will be adopted. Again, male person. So, I will try to make some brief conclusions. European monarchies demonstrated adaptability to new social and political circumstances, and this is the main reason, one might say, for their survival. These adaptations are not just in terms of the scope, or better to say, exercise of formal political powers, but also regarding other issues related to the status of monarchs and royal families. This trend of introducing gender equality most probably will continue. I mentioned the example of Spain, also some other monarchies. But what about other restrictions? There are some other restrictions, some of them, for example, related to the marital status and some other restriction regarding this issue, most probably will require further review in the future. However, some other restrictions are more strongly rooted in history and tradition of European monarchies. For example, religious affiliation of monarchs, because in some states, monarch is at the same time a head of the church. So it is not easy to expect that these rules will be changed, because monarch is understood as a symbol of history and tradition of respected country. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Milinković, for a very interesting presentation. And we now move on to our third speaker, Dr. Ki-won Hong from the Korean University at Sejong. Can you hear us? Yes?
Thank you very much. Yes. Let me share my slides with you. Give me some seconds. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Very good. I'm from not from Korea University at Sejong. Recently I moved to another university, which is called Yonsei University in Seoul. But it doesn't matter much.
My apologies.
Wherever I belong, it's okay. And thank you very much for this priceless opportunity to share my research on the paradox of Deborah and the Calvinist opposition to Gynecocracy in the 16th century. After the conquest of Canaan, the Israelite tribes established a form of government ruled by judges, one after another, from Joshua, the successor of Moses, down to Samuel. Among these 16 judges, only one was female. Her name was Deborah. She is described in the book of Judges as the prominent leader who prophesied a woman's contribution to the Israeli definite victory over the Canaanite oppressors, which was later carried out in effect by Jael, a Canaanite woman who assassinated Sisera, the commander-in-chief under Jabin, king of Hazor. This story from the Judeo-Christian tradition in which Deborah has been referred to as the example of a female leadership. When Elizabeth I was elevated to the throne of England, the inscription, Deborah, the judge and restorer of Israel, was shining over her head like a halo. The image of Deborah as a female leader is sustained today as well. Thus, Regina Jonas, the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi, used Deborah as a support for women's ordination. The usage of the biblical figure followed by later by women from different corners in Judeo-Christian and evangelical cultures. In spite of this long tradition, it must be noted, however, that the secularized canonization of Deborah was not the case with all thinkers from these cultural backgrounds, particularly not with the Calvinists during the Wars of Religion in France and in British Islands. To review how things were going in the 16th century in this regard, my presentation today will begin by focusing on one famous French Calvinist lawyer named François Ottoman. Ottoman is considered as one of the precursors who argued for the French constitutional tradition of elective kingship and mixed constitution. He tasked himself as a lawyer on one hand and as a Protestant thinker on the other to expound the theological foundations of this political doctrine. The result of his long-time work was Consolatio et Sacris Litteris Petita, posthumously published in 1593, in which he presented the political history of the Hebrews to explain the will of God. The first steps were dedicated to define the nature and godly purpose of the first government in the Old Testament. That was the government ruled by the judges. Ottoman viewed the role of these judges as liberating the Hebrews from the state of being oppressed. That's why he called them liberators of the people. By the way, among his remarks on these rulers, those on Deborah are particularly interesting from our point of view, because God's choice of the female deliverer perplexed the Protestant thinker with a question that is linked to his political doctrine and to the actuality of the Kingdom of France, Gynecocracy. It is well known that Ottoman was opposing to the participation of women in government. The succession of a woman to the crown was for him out of the question. Moreover, at the time of the Wars of Religion, the Huguenots were attributing to Catherine de' Medici a considerable responsibility for the national calamity, in particular for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So the question that here arises can be rephrased as follows. How to explain the government by a female liberator of the Israelites without any contradiction between Protestant exegesis and political doctrine? Ottoman could only solve the problem by making a rationalist account of God's will. It was, he says, according to the arcane will of God, that Deborah was elected the deliverer of the Hebrews. The Republic of the, I quote, the Republic of the Hebrews was governed not according to the human reason, nor according to the will of man, but really according to the judgment and wisdom of God alone. Therefore, I quote, it would be very absurd to induce from this godly will the principle or doctrine of the government of queens. It is not surprising to see Ottoman add that, and still it is necessary that women be willingly subjected to the authority and command of their man. It would be interesting and very important to note then that it would have been difficult for Ottoman to justify his stance regarding the unfitness of women to rule, either on the biblical source or on Calvin's teachings. Firstly, the chapter 1 of the book of Genesis did not directly hint at the subordination of the female to the male, even though many authors have been habitually interpreting Genesis, chapter 4 and Psalms chapter 8 as the source to justify the man's superior ability to rule in comparison with those of women. Secondly, the father of the Genevan Reformation tried to show that woman had been created to some degree, to the same degree of dignity as man. He says, I quote, "Certainly, we cannot deny that woman too was created in the image of God, even though she was so in the second chance. Consequently, we must conclude that what was spoken of in the creation of the man belongs to the female too." From this point of view of history, written in the Old Testament too, Ottoman's stance was hardly justifiable. For in theocracy of Israel, women to have enjoyed the equality of sexes before God when they assumed public offices. For example, prophetesses Huldah and Noadiah, Judge Deborah, and Queen Atalia. Then, where did the Calvinists' belief in the female's inferiority come from? Their belief was in part supported by the small number of female leaders, which they argued would translate the exceptional nature of a gynecocracy. But their belief in the female inferiority stemmed more from Paul, who had prohibited women from teachings as well as from taking authority over man. This is the question which populist Calvin the most when he tried to conciliate the examples of gynecocracy in the Old Testament with the Pauline doctrine of a masculine superiority. The solution which Calvin found at last was to explain Deborah's case by referring to the exceptional circumstances of her days. That is, in her days, the state of Israel was not in normal situation to such a degree that they, in the form of a very loose confederation, had to confront the strong Canaan forces. The Israeli Confederation was experiencing a cruel, barbarous, and bleeding crisis. This particularity of days drew attention of Calvin so as to suggest as a solution the distinction between the common order, which God wants us to abide by, to the same degree as a principle, and another order which God gives us in a strange way. Calvin continues, a legislator can enact a law which appears to be contrary to godly principle. That's why he called even a woman to rule or teach. Therefore, Deborah's rule was not in fact contrary to the will of God as a whole. It just seemed so. Moreover, Calvin did not forget to note that Deborah's rule was rooted in the confused circumstances due to the faults of man. The political doctrine which fitted the most into the Calvinist interpretative solution was that of Philip de Morny, the author of the Vindicae contra Tyrannos. Morny's doctrine can be said to truly conform to that of Calvin. For, first of all, the word man in its text often refers to both sexes without distinguishing man from woman. This means Morny thought both sexes to have one common nature as human beings as created by God. Morny's doctrine conforms to that of Calvin also in the sense that he seems to acknowledge the legitimacy of Deborah's regime, with the exceptional circumstances of a paralyzed government, the magistrates taken into consideration. Whether it may be a man or a woman, once confronting a soul-devastating tyranny, human beings are obliged to get their soul back. According to the typical doctrine of a Huguenot, it is the inferior magistrate who are allowed to take arms to resist the tyrant who was originally their superior magistrate. However, according to Mornay, in contrast, the right to resistance is allowed not only to inferior magistrate, but also to the personnel charged of religious offices in the case that the government magistrate doesn't work anymore. The similar political situation in the British Islands, we move to the Britain, and the European dimension of the Reformation involved the certain authors in the controversy of a Gynecocracy. John Knox, the famous Calvinist of Scotland, was among them. It is well known that he was always hostile to Gynecocracy, not only under Mary Tudor, but also under Elizabeth I. Trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women is considered as the most theoretical and less political text among the whole literature in question. In this writing, Knox argued that Gynecocracy is contrary to nature, insulting God, and subversive of good order. By alluding to the evidence from natural body, he argues that man is at the head, while woman is at the body. For the nature inscribed for all kinds of animals a certain mark of dominion, the male, and a certain subjection, the female. For Knox, as well as for his friend Christopher Goodman, the monarchs must be chosen from the brothers, as was dictated in the Deuteronomy chapter 17. I quote, "Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set as king over thee. Thou may not set a stranger over thee, who is not thy brother." Of course, John Knox acknowledges that the case of Deborah constitutes an exception to this principle. However, this does not mean that he accepted the possibility of a Gynecocracy in general. Women were so cursed that they lack intellectual capabilities and therefore are not fit to rule. Exceptions do not make a common law. So, for John Knox, even if there is a certain kingdom which conserves long-time practices or customary law to be governed by a female, this does not constitute a legitimate precedent. Lacking the capability of ruling, a female will never concede to man any part of power which does not actually belong to her from the beginning. For this reason, John Knox did not expect a Deborah from his contemporary women. All that he expected from women was that they paid careful attention to his advices. This is what he in fact expected from Mary of Guise, Queen of Scotland from 1538 to 1542, but in vain. It is noteworthy here that the stance of Calvin differed from that of Knox in this regard. In a letter to William Cecil, the chief advisor of Elizabeth I, Calvin showed his distance from the author of the First Blessed. For Calvin, women too can legitimately succeed to the throne of a nation. It is in this sense, wrote Calvin, queens as nursing mothers of the church should be distinguished from private women. Calvin admits that there are some women who are so gifted that they can prove that they are guided in fact by God. It is this person, whether it may be a Moses or Deborah who plays a role of a liberator of the people from the oppression by a tyranny. Praises that he once dedicated to Runcheva of France, who supported him since his first exile from France, and to Margaret of Angoulême, who did her best to protect the reformers, even though she was not a Calvinist herself, or not contrary to his own theological doctrine. Concluding remarks. In spite of John Calvin's initial doctrine, theological doctrine in favor of gynecocracy, the posterior Calvinists were, most of Calvinists were in fact opposing to the gynecocracy. Why is that? I think it depended on the political and religious circumstances of each country over those days. It was, in brief, it was due to the words of a religion. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And now we move on for our last paper for the session, a co-authored paper by two professors from the Justinianus Primus faculty in North Macedonia, Professor Hristina Runcheva Tasev and Professor Katerina Shapkova Kocevska. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to participate at this interesting conference. Let me introduce myself. I'm Hristina Runcheva Tasev, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law Justinianus Primus at St. Cyril and Methodius University in Skopje, and together with my colleague Katerina Shapkova Kocevska, also a colleague professor, associate professor, will present briefly the paper that is entitled Electoral Representation of Women on National and Local Level. Are women fit to govern in the Republic of North Macedonia? So as far as I heard the previous presenters, we will give a more contemporary context of women representation in parliament and on local level. And our paper mainly is focused on what types of measures should be introduced for women to become equal to men when it comes to representation in government. I don't think that there is a specific need to discuss about how important are women and how important is political representation of women as a very important precondition for better reach and involvement of women in policy making. Because this has been a process that has been ongoing in many parliaments throughout Europe. Macedonian parliament has also been part of this process. And many governments and parties have put many efforts for, as our legislation mentions, a less represented gender. So there are no women specified in domestic legislation, but it's always also qualified as less represented gender, which might give an opportunity maybe some years in the future to turn the roles, because it doesn't specify whether which gender is less represented. And the institutional architecture basically is very important if it's based on principles of equal opportunities for men and women. And we are also very much aware that this gender policymaking, this gender-sensitive policymaking is quite important, because there are many areas where this kind of policy making, women can contribute on many topics, on many issues like education, conflict resolution. When it comes to social care, healthcare, we know that the nature of women is quite different, and their sensitivity when it comes to deciding of very important society issues. So the results have been proven in many occasions. So how is the Macedonian case? Are the women fit to rule when it comes to decision-making in the parliament and on local level? We've been making this research based on the statistics about the women representation in the parliament and on a local level with available data. And the presence of women in government on national and local level was registered and can be concluded after seeing the results that this process of empowering women has been considered as a positive. Let's say, why is it positive? Women are very often have positive impact. They are drivers of change, but they have not been represented on local level and in parliaments on a sufficient level before the quotas were introduced. So the number of women represented on both levels of government indicates that we're still far away from achieving full gender parity and equal opportunities. The change of women representation was introduced in 2002 when for the first time the quotas for women representation in the parliament are introduced. And these quotas at first introduced 30% of the candidates submitted by the political parties should be consisted by women. And this instrument was misused by the political parties because 30% were set like option. You can we have proportional model, and you know when you have 30% women represented means that they are not set into a zip system. So basically, what did the parties do and how they manipulated was putting the women at the bottom of the list and fulfilling the formal criteria of having 30% women being represented on one hand, and on the other hand, having a parliament also full with male representatives because they were kind of misusing this opportunity. 4 years after, there was a club of women MPs that was established within the parliament. I joined the parliament a bit later in 2008 as a member of parliament, but previously I also been part of these processes. And from personal experience, I can say that this process has been a tough process to put the women in a kind of a zip model for representation. What does it mean? Actually, the new law that was adopted in 2006 states that 30% should be women, but there should be one female candidate on each 3 candidates on the list. Because we have proportional model and our lists are consisted of 20 candidates in 6 electoral districts, that means that 30% of women are represented in the parliament. And this was the first positive outcome after the quotas were introduced. Later on, this process was upgraded with the gender equality law that was adopted in 2012. But today, we also have additional provisions which lead towards the goal that is set by the women MPs nowadays, and this is 50-50 representation, which has not been yet achieved. But the changes in legislation in 2014, in 2015, now as a result of these changes, we have the Article 64 of the Electoral Code that stipulates that at least 40% of the candidates on the list of candidates for deputies, but also this has been introduced for the members of the councils of municipalities. They should belong to the less represented gender. Which means obliging the political entities that out of every 3 seats, at least 1 seat belongs to less represented gender, and in addition, at least 1 place for every 10 places. And these quotas actually have set the women representation on higher level. But if you see the areas where they are not covered with quotas, for example, the government, the current government is consisted of 21 members and only 4 of them are women, which says that when we don't have the quotas, we still don't have this political culture to include more women in governing. And Katerina will follow up with results from local elections. Of course, there are no quotas for mayors to be elected, female mayors to be elected, but generally you can see that women are better represented only if the institutions apply gender quota, like parliament or the councils at municipal level, and in other situations like high governmental levels, then officials are mainly, and mayors are mainly represented by male candidates that have been elected. I'm not sure whether the quotas will work if they're removed. The experience on the world level, according to IPU, says that quotas may have different effect. After they have been abolished, in some countries, they result with more female representation in government. On the other hand, there are countries where when you remove the quotas, then the number of women represented in the parliament, in government, immediately decreases. So this is very interesting phenomenon, and I guess it depends on the political cultures of the countries. But however, quotas in our case work well because they have been followed by sanctions. For instance, you cannot submit, as a political party, you cannot submit a list of candidates unless there is a sufficient women representation according to the legislation. So it means that the state electoral committee will not accept the list of candidates, and this is a conditio sine qua non for submitting lists, and that's how we reached this number of female representatives in the parliament and in the councils of local government. So the numbers more precisely will be presented by my colleague Katerina, who is better dealing with numbers than myself, since she teaches economy for our students of law. So Katerina, the floor is yours, and at the end we'll be both here and open for questions.
Thank you very much, Hristina. My name is Katerina Shapkova Kocevska. I also come from the Faculty of Law in Skopje. And my role in this research was to collect data, analyze data about the representation of women both on national and on local level in the Republic of North Macedonia. What we have done in this research is that we go through the data on national level. So we collected data about the women representation in the National Assembly. And on local level, described as women representation as mayors, and also as members of the councils of the municipalities of the country. When it comes to the parliament, we analyze results from 9 separate election cycles, starting from 1994 to 2020. So this period covers the actually the modern history of the country since the independence until today. The data are collected from the official website of the National Assembly, sobranie.mk, and here on the graph are visualized the number of male and female members of the parliament in each of the election cycles, and the percentage of women on the right side on the graph, the percentage of women in the total number of seats in the parliament. What can be seen from the graph and from our analysis is that in the first 2, or I can say 3 cycles of election in 1994, 1998, and 2002, actually this was the time before introducing the gender quotas, we can see that the number of female members of the parliament is very low. Only 4 women in 1994, 8 in 1998, and the number increased above 20 in 2002. But having in mind this whole innovation in the legal culture and in the laws of the country, we can see a trend of increasing the number of women that are elected as members of the parliament. The highest number of female members of the parliament was in 2016, when 45 women were actually out of 120 were elected as members of the parliament. And in 2020, where 42 women, also out of 120 members, were actually women. We can see that the electoral representation of women in the parliament in the recent years varies between 30 and 40%, and in the last 3 cycles it's above 35%, speaking then more than 1/3 of the members of the parliament are women, are female. when it comes to the local policy or local politics, we have different situation. Here we analyzed, are women present as mayors of the local governments of the municipalities in the country. We analyzed 5 different election cycles from 2005 to 2021. Because before 2005, there was different organizations in the municipalities of the country, a different number of organizations with different responsibilities. So we took the number of municipalities that is pretty much constant from 2005 to until recently. In the beginning, it was 85. In the past 15 years, it's 81 municipalities, including the city of Skopje. What was the case here when we discuss about women as mayors? We can see that it's the blue bars on the graph on the left side. The number of female mayors is very low compared to their male colleagues. In 2005, only 2 out of 85 mayors in the country were women. In 2009, all of them were men. 2013, 3 women. 2007, this is the highest number, only 6 mayors were women. And 2021, also we have a decrease, only 2. In relative terms, the number of mayors, female mayors, varies between 2 and 6%, depending on the elections. This is not only the case. We were trying to understand why is this happening when it comes to mayors. And one of the possible reasons was that the voters are not interested in voting for women. So we looked at the list of candidates for the local elections. But here we saw something similar when it comes to the elected mayors. Women are not only elected as mayors in local governments, but they also are not interested in candidating to be a mayor. So they're not interested to run for this position. When we compare the number of candidates for mayors in 2013, 2017, and 2021, we can see that approximately 20 women were present on the list of candidates, and there were more than 230 males. So the number of male candidates for mayors of the local municipalities exceeds the number of female candidates by more than 10 times. So this is one possible explanation why the number of mayors that are women is very low compared to the number of mayor candidates. Interestingly, this was not the case with the municipality councils, because as Hristina mentioned before, there is an obligation when candidates lists are created for the councils of the municipality to respect the gender quota. And we presented the data from the 2017 and 2021 local elections. And we saw that in the respective years, third of the elected members of the councils were actually women. So in 2017, around 450 women were elected as councillors, and around 900 men were elected as councillors, meaning ideal third. 33.3% of the councillors in that election year were women. In 2021, we have improvement by 3 percentage points. 36.3% of the councillors that were elected were female, were women. Here we would like just to point out one very interesting information. Not only that we calculated the total number of councillors that are male and female, we also compared the number of councillors that are male and the number of councillors that are female within the same municipalities. And we got this result, which is a very powerful information speaking about gender equality in the councils. In 2017, there was only one municipality in the country out of 81 where the number of female councillors exceeded the number of male councillors. In 2021, there are only 2 municipalities with higher number of women councillors compared to male councillors. We can conclude from this analysis much detailed information about separate regions and municipalities will be included in our paper. But here I would just like to present that the general conclusions that we have derived from our research is that the gender quotas give results when it comes to national and local representation of women in the national parliament and in the councils of the municipalities. We have pretty strong participation of the women in these two entities between 30 and 40%. But when it comes to the national government or to when it comes to the situation where women run for mayors of the local municipalities, we saw quite different situation where only 2 to 6% of the total number of mayors in different years were elected were female. What we can conclude is actually we tested the efficiency of the gender quotas. We saw that the gender quotas in our country are giving results. So we have better involvement in the politics by women. But still, we are a little bit skeptical if quotas are not introduced, what will happen, having in mind the case of the mayors and having in mind the case of the number of ministers that are female. We believe that gender quotas should be combined with alternative solutions that will improve the political culture in the country, and will create institutional and cultural framework that will empower women in order to have a voluntary approach towards politics and to be self-motivated to take their future in their hands and to be proactive when it comes to, especially on a local level and at the local governments. Here I would stop with the presentation and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank all the participants. We are slightly behind schedule, but since the next break is the longer lunch break, I do hope we can have some questions because the papers were all very interesting. They've covered a very large span from antiquity to the contemporary situation from two different points of view, both individual women in power, monarchs and judges like Deborah, and women in assemblies. And I think many interesting questions can be asked, so please, are there any? If someone online has a question but you can't turn on your microphone, feel free to type it in the chat. Professor Poloyets has a question. Go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Igor Milinković. You said that as exception, monarchy can exist with a collective head of the state. For me, it seems like contradictio in adjecta, and so I would like to ask you whether you have any example or is it only in theory like that? Thank
you. Thank you very much for your question. Actually, I quoted some sources which are identified in ancient Greece, diarchies. So it is one of examples, perhaps not perfect, but that would be an example of a collective, we might say, head of the state. Thank you.
Josie has a question. Again, I can't turn the camera to you, but we'll hear you.
Maybe it's for the best. My question is also for Professor Igor, and it is again a short one. You have mentioned the tendencies of modernization when it comes to gender equality and generally equality in the matters of succession. And you have given us some nice examples with the model in the Netherlands. And do you have any mentions of in the times before the 20th century that some modernizing efforts have been tried? Because we have the case of the Netherlands and Belgium and Great Britain that have all in the past 3 or 4 decades changed their laws of succession in order to allow for absolute primogeniture to be the dominant principle. So is there any, in your research of course, is there any example of these modernizing tendencies earlier, or did we just have the cases of ad hoc changes because some rulers had only daughters or some other less suitable heirs according to traditional principles?
Thank you for your question. In my research, I focused on the contemporary solutions, but there are some examples before the dominance of Salic law that there were some solutions that were more appropriate, I would say, but I didn't. At this stage of my research, I didn't analyze these examples. Thank you.
If there's no one else, I'd abuse my privilege as moderator to ask a question from Dr. Ki-Won Hong. You mentioned that Calvin settled on the notion that gynecocracy was an exception that confirmed the rule. But some of the quotes that you've presented show ideas towards a different direction. So do you think, is there enough in the sources to answer the question, was that really what Calvin believed, that females were only exceptionally when God gave them the sign capable of governing, or did he maybe make a compromise there for practical reasons?
Thank you for your question. Even within the interpretations of Calvin's own doctrine, there is a different versions of interpretation. And some scholars argue that Calvin was always opposing to the gynecocracy. But my opinion is different from those scholars. One of them is John Lee Thompson. But I cannot agree with him, because from my own close reading of Calvin's text, Calvin's writings, he never said that, he never affirmed the inferiority of women to men. Generally speaking, he always argued for the, in a certain sense, for the because both men and women were created by God. Of course, there is a it was a secondly that a woman Eve was created from the bones of Adam, but that does not tell that the women is inferior for the reason to man. That from my own reading of Calvin's text, that is my own understanding of Calvin's doctrine regarding the equality of sex gynecocracy. Anyhow, there can be some different opinions regarding Calvin's stance, but it is open. It is open to readers how to understand his text.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? I can't resist just one brief anachronistic parallel between our first and our last paper, because they both concern women's role in the state as such. You mentioned our colleague Chalkias mentioned in the quote from Lysistrata where the women contribute to the state because they sacrifice the sons that they gave birth to and so on. And it, again, in the context of ancient Greece, reminds me of Sparta, where maybe women had slightly more individual liberties compared to women in other Greek polis, because as a whole, the polis was focused on a collective effort of breeding strong Spartan warriors, and women were seen as strong contributors to their cause, being the mothers. And again, in the modern situation, inspired by the statistics that our North Macedonian colleagues have provided to us, we see again that women are pushing through in the assemblies where the collective work is done, but we have much less women in individual offices, and that again must be, at least in part, due to the fact that women are still more burdened with the family duties, and those individual offices are much more demanding, take up a lot of time. They're not just a full-time job, they're an overtime job. So if any of you three has anything to comment on that, I'd be very happy.
Shall I speak? A main difference between ancient Sparta and ancient Athens was the lack of property in ancient Sparta. So this difference is crucial to understand the role of women in these two polis. In Athens, the main qualification for someone to be a citizen, an Athenian citizen, was being a son of having both of his parents Athenians, and the main criterion for being a free man was having property. This property should be passed on to his sons. So women were restricted in the limits of the house, so that the possibilities of having intercourse with another man, so that a son would come out of this, and having problems with the heritage, with the norm, with the passing of the property was crucial. The limitations of the woman in ancient Athens, in classical Athens, were directly connected with the notion that noble heirs should be born, so that the paternal property would not be lost. It was the foundations of the state, of democracy.
Thank you.
Well, if I may add some contemporary context to this, basically, I think that there is still it is still a big issue in the democracies about equal representation, and still much efforts have been put on this, and workshops and funds and raising awareness, accepting women. But I completely agree with you that women at some point withdraw when it comes to a position when they should undertake the full responsibility, because they still spend a lot of time on different areas, especially in the house and the family, being a main caregiver for the children. But if you take the contemporary example of Ursula von der Leyen, who is running the European Commission for almost 3 years, and who is a mother of 7 children, then you may say that even top positions in policy might be set for women which are capable for that, whether that would be in the later stages of her life when she will not be so much attached to the family, because it takes really a lot of time and energy. But at some points, I think that there is, it's all about the political culture and acceptance by the societies to accept the fact that women are capable to run something bigger than a family. If she knows to run a family, she can run also a country or institution or have a responsibility in different areas. So let's finish with a little positive expectations about small democracies like ours on the Balkans, that changes will happen, but it takes much more time because the political culture works on different speed than the European democracies coming from Western Europe.
Thank you very much. I thank all the participants once again. We are now taking a break for lunch, and we're continuing at 3 o'clock with a very interesting double keynote lecture by Professors Pantelis Chalkias and Isabel Grimm-Stadelmann. Until then, have a nice lunch break. Thank you all.